Mark Alvarez woke to a smell that had no business drifting through his bedroom window at midnight, thick, sour, and wrong. By the time he got dressed and out to his east field with a flashlight, the trucks were already gone. What they'd left behind stretched across nearly 4 acres of ground he'd spent an entire season resting. One look told him this wasn't an accident. Someone had picked his empty field on purpose. What they didn't know yet, they just handed him the strangest, most valuable mistake of his life. 1 week earlier, none of this had even started. Mark Alvarez had run his own diversified farm outside Corwin Flats for 12 years, long enough to know that a good field sometimes needed nothing done to it at all. He'd bought the place young, scraping together a down payment from years of working other people's ground first, and he'd never once let himself take the land for granted the way some 3rd and 4th generation growers around Corwin Flats seemed to. Every field on his farm earned its keep through careful attention, not habit. His east field had grown the same rotation of vegetables for 6 straight seasons, and Mark could read the signs in the soil the way other people read a weather forecast. Yields creeping down, roots showing more stress each year, a tired kind of ground that no amount of fertilizer was going to fix on its own. So that spring, he made the call to leave it fallow. No planting. Just rest, and time, and a cover crop turned under to rebuild what 6 seasons of hard use had worn away. From the county road, it looked like exactly what it was, an empty field, doing nothing, on a farm surrounded by every neighboring row planted tight and green. A few of the older growers had already ribbed him about it at the co-op, in the good-natured way neighbors do when they think you're leaving money on the table. Mark didn't mind the look of it. He minded, more, what was about to happen to that empty ground because of who he'd made an enemy of the year before. The trouble started the year before, when Mark noticed the wastewater draining off the processing plant bordering his property had turned a nearby irrigation ditch a color it had no business being. He reported it to the county. The investigation that followed cost the plant a fine, a new wastewater permit process, and, as he'd find out later, a great deal of resentment aimed squarely at him. Nobody at the plant said his name out loud when the fine hit the local paper. They didn't have to. Within weeks, Mark noticed his seed orders taking longer to fill through the co-op the plant's owners had ties to. A produce buyer who'd worked with him for years suddenly stopped returning calls. Small things. Nothing he could prove was connected. All of it adding up to a clear, quiet message: speaking up had a price, and he was still paying it. He didn't regret the report. He just hadn't expected how long the cost of doing the right thing could keep coming due. If you've ever spoken up about something wrong and paid a quiet price for it afterward, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Because Mark's price was about to get a lot louder. Subscribe now, because you won't want to miss what happens next. Denny Colvin had run floor operations at the processing plant for 11 years, and Mark Alvarez's report had made his job considerably harder. New disposal protocols, new paperwork, new costs eating into a budget he was already expected to hold flat. He wasn't the one who'd signed off on the dumping that used to happen, but he was the one who dealt with the fallout every single day since the complaint. Around the plant floor, Mark's name had become shorthand for every headache that had landed on Denny's desk that year. When a hauling contractor mentioned a load of cull tomatoes with nowhere approved to go that week, the usual disposal site over capacity, a permit delay tying up the backup option, Denny looked out across the road at Mark Alvarez's empty east field and made a decision that wasn't his to make, and wasn't going to end the way he expected. Mark woke to the sound of engines just after midnight, not unusual out here, where trucks ran the county roads at all hours during processing season. He didn't think much of it until the smell reached his window an hour later, thick and sour and unmistakably wrong, seeping in through the screen even with the window barely cracked. He lay there a minute longer than he should have, telling himself it was probably nothing, some load shifted wrong on the highway, nothing to do with him at all. But something about the way the engines had idled too long near his own property line before pulling away kept him from settling back to sleep. By the time he got dressed and out to the east field with a flashlight, the trucks were already gone. This was the scene the flashlight had already shown you. Mounds of rotten, split open tomatoes, dumped in uneven piles across ground he'd spent an entire season resting and preparing. He stood at the edge of that field a long time, flashlight beam shaking slightly in his hand, before he let himself understand what he was actually looking at. Not an accident. Not a mistake in the dark. Someone had chosen his empty field on purpose, betting he'd have no way to prove who, and no real way to fight back. Daylight made it worse, not better. The full scope of it stretched across nearly 4 acres, split, rotting tomatoes ground into the soil, the whole field reeking in the rising heat, flies already gathering by the hundreds. Mark walked every row of it that morning, camera in hand, photographing the damage the way he'd learned to document anything involving the plant since his report the year before. His hands shook the entire time, not from fear exactly, but from something closer to a raw physical anger he hadn't let himself feel yet. A whole season of careful soil recovery, buried under someone else's mess, dumped by people who'd clearly assumed an empty field meant nobody would notice or care enough to make it a problem. They were wrong about that. Mark just didn't know yet how right they'd accidentally turned out to be about something else entirely. Mark drove into town that same morning and filed a report with the county. Illegal dumping, agricultural land, no permit. No consent. The deputy who took his statement was polite enough, but the message underneath the politeness was familiar by now. Without a truck plate number or a witness, there wasn't much of a case to build. He mentioned the plant by name as the obvious source, given the timing and given history. The deputy wrote it down without much conviction in his pen. "We'll look into it," he said, in the tone of someone who had 6 other reports on his desk that felt more urgent than a field full of rotten tomatoes. Mark left that office with a case number and very little else. He understood, driving home, that whatever happened next on that field was going to be mostly up to him to figure out. Hector Delgado had worked Mark's farm for 9 years, long enough that he didn't need an explanation when he pulled up that morning and found him standing in the ruined field, camera still in hand. He just grabbed a shovel from the truck bed and started working alongside him, clearing a path through the worst of it so equipment could at least get through if needed. "We'll figure out what this ground needs next," he said, after a while, when the silence between them had stretched long enough. "Same as we always do. This might be more than we can just work our way through, Hector." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's just another mess, and we've cleaned up plenty of those before." He kept digging. He didn't say anything else about it that day, and Mark understood that his showing up, without being asked, was its own kind of answer. The twist came about a week later, and it caught Mark harder than the dumping itself had. Word started moving through Corwin Flats that the plant's insurance carrier had opened a quiet inquiry, not into the plant, but into him. The theory, as Mark eventually heard it secondhand at the co-op, was that he'd arranged the whole thing himself. Paid a hauler off the books to dump waste on his own idle field. Generated a sympathetic story, and set the stage to squeeze a bigger settlement out of the plant's insurer than the original wastewater fine had ever cost them. A man that bitter about one report, the theory went, might easily be bitter enough to stage something worse to finish the job. An old acquaintance, a grower named Pruitt he'd known for years, finally said it to his face outside the co-op instead of behind his back. "Folks are saying you might have had a hand in your own bad luck." "Mark. I told them that didn't sound like you. But I figured you'd want to hear it from somebody instead of just feeling it in the room." "I didn't touch a claim form, Pruitt. Haven't filed for a dime beyond the county report." "I believe you," Pruitt said, though something in the way he said it made clear not everyone else did. It wasn't true. But the rumor didn't need to be true to work. It just needed to make his neighbors pause half a second longer before they said hello to him at the feed store, and that half second told him everything about how far the plant's allies were willing to go to make sure nobody believed him twice. The hauling quotes came back worse than Mark expected, and now they came with an added weight he hadn't planned for: an insurance investigator's card sitting on his kitchen counter. A polite letter asking him to preserve all records related to the incident. Clearing 4 acres of dumped, rotting produce and trucking it to an approved disposal site would run close to what he'd budgeted for the entire East Field's next 2 planting seasons combined. He called 2 more hauling companies that afternoon, hoping for a number that made more sense, and got the same figure twice over, give or take a few $100s either way. Insurance wouldn't cover the cleanup itself. Dumped waste on fallow ground didn't fit any policy he'd ever bought, and now the same insurer investigating the plant's liability was quietly circling him instead. Treating his own field like it might be the crime scene of a fraud he hadn't committed. He sat at his kitchen table that night running the numbers 3 different ways, looking for an option that didn't exist, the investigator's letter sitting unopened beside the calculator. The county extension office sent Julie Ruiz out that week, following up on Mark's report through an entirely different channel: agricultural land use, not law enforcement or insurance, but someone whose job it was to know what dumped organic waste actually did to farmland. She walked the field slowly, taking soil samples, asking careful technical questions about his original cover crop and rotation plan. Then she said something Mark hadn't expected to hear from anyone that week. "You know," she said, crouching to examine a rotting tomato half sunk into the soil, "if this were intentional, this is almost exactly what a biosolarization treatment looks like. Organic matter, high sugar content, laid down right before peak summer heat." She looked up at him. "There's real research on using tomato processing waste this way, out of the Kearney Ag Center. It's meant to kill off nematodes, soil pathogens, weed seeds, using heat and decomposition instead of chemical fumigants." Mark stood there a long moment, turning that idea over, feeling something shift for the first time since the rumor had started following him around town. If you've never heard of biosolarization before this moment, neither had Mark, and it's about to save his entire field. This is exactly the kind of real, verified agricultural science we dig into every episode here on Farm Route Chronicles. Subscribe now if you want to keep learning the actual research behind these stories, because it only gets more interesting from here. Julie was careful not to oversell it. "This isn't a guarantee," she told him. "But if you tarp this field now, seal it under clear plastic, let the heat and the decomposition do their work through the hottest part of the summer, you might come out the other side of this with healthier soil than you had before any of this happened." The alternative was still on the table: haul it all away, eat the cost, start the rotation plan over from nothing, and hope the insurance inquiry quietly lost interest in him along the way. Mark thought about the money he didn't have for that option, and he thought about Denny Colvin assuming he had no way to turn any of this back on the plant, and no way to clear his own name either. "Let's tarp it," he said. "If they wanted to bury my field in their mess and my name in their rumor, we're going to see exactly what that mess is actually good for." Hector helped him order the plastic sheeting that same week. Julie promised to come back and test the soil properly once the season's heat had done what it was going to do. By July, the field sat sealed under clear plastic sheeting from end to end, the tarp fogged with condensation, the whole thing looking, from the road, almost stranger than the pile of rotten tomatoes had. Mark checked the soil temperature under that plastic most mornings, watching numbers climb into ranges Julie had told him mattered: hot enough, held long enough, to do real damage to whatever had been quietly limiting that field's yields for years before any of this happened. It was a strange kind of waiting, made stranger by the insurance investigator's occasional follow-up calls, each one a small reminder that clearing his name and healing his field had somehow become the same waiting game. Some mornings he stood at the edge of that tarp longer than the temperature check actually required, just looking at it, the way a person checks on something they aren't sure they're allowed to hope about yet. He couldn't see anything working under that plastic. He just had to trust a process happening entirely out of sight, in soil he couldn't touch again until the heat had finished whatever it was going to do. Word had gotten around Corwin Flats about the dumping and the rumor both, the way word always did, and together they put Mark exactly where Denny Colvin had probably hoped he'd land. Humiliated, suspected, maybe finally quiet about the plant's business for good. He ran into Denny once that summer. At the feed store, both of them reaching for the same aisle at the same time. Denny didn't apologize, and he didn't bother hiding a small, satisfied look either. "Heard the insurance folks have been asking around about you," he said, like he hadn't helped start that particular fire himself. Shame. Empty ground's hard enough to make pay without extra trouble on top of it. "It's not empty anymore," Mark said. "It's working on something." He didn't explain further. He didn't owe Denny an explanation for anything happening under that plastic, least of all the part where Denny's own mess might end up being the best thing that ever happened to that field, and the thing that finally cleared his name too. Julie came back in late August to pull the tarp and test the soil properly, the same careful methodical process she'd used the first day she walked that field. The samples told a clear story once the lab results came back. Nematode populations that had been quietly suppressing yields on that field for years were down dramatically. Soil pathogen counts showed the same pattern. Weed seed viability had dropped further than Julie said she typically saw even in properly managed solarization treatments. "Whoever dumped this load did you an accidental favor," she told him, reviewing the numbers at his kitchen table. "I've run biosolarization trials on research plots that didn't come out this clean." Mark sat with that a long moment, thinking about Denny Colvin's small satisfied smile at the feed store, and felt something close to a laugh rise up through months of exhaustion and suspicion. Mark planted that field that fall, the same rotation he'd always intended for it, watching closely for any sign the disaster had left something behind he hadn't accounted for. What came up instead was the healthiest stand he'd grown on that ground in 6 years. Germination came in faster and more even than any of his other fields that season. Rows filling in solid within days where he'd expected the usual gaps and stragglers. By the time the crop was established, the difference was visible from the county road. The same kind of visible difference that had once been a field full of rotten tomatoes was now a field outperforming every other acre on his farm. Leaves a deeper green, stems thicker, roots pulling up firm and pale when he checked them by hand. Hector walked the rows with him the day he was sure of it, crouching every few feet to turn over a plant and check the roots himself, saying very little, the way he usually did when something mattered too much for easy words. He just nodded, once, at the end of the row, and that was enough. Julie presented the full comparison at the county's fall agricultural extension meeting, the same kind of room where farmers from across Corwin Flats gathered to hear real data, not gossip. The numbers weren't subtle. Mark's East Field showed yields nearly 40% above his farm's 5-year average for that ground. Alongside soil health metrics Julie said she rarely saw outside of a controlled research trial. She walked the room through the nematode counts, the pathogen suppression, the weed seed viability drop, laying it out the same careful way she'd laid it out for Mark at his own kitchen table weeks before. In that same meeting, word arrived that the county's dumping investigation had reached its own conclusion. Finally connecting the disposal manifests to the missing load of cull tomatoes, paperwork Denny Colvin had filled out sloppily enough to leave a clear trail once someone actually went looking hard, a hauling date and a destination field number that matched Mark's property down to the parcel line. The insurance inquiry into Mark closed within the week. The fraud theory quietly abandoned the moment the real paper trail surfaced. 2 doubts, cleared in the same season, by nothing but evidence. The room understood exactly what that meant without anyone needing to say Denny Colvin's name out loud. If you've ever had someone try to bury you in their own mess, only to watch it become the thing that lifted you up instead, I want to hear that story in the comments tonight. And if this is your first time here, subscribe, because Farm Route Chronicles is full of stories exactly like Mark's, people who turn someone else's cruelty into their own quiet proof. Denny Colvin lost his position at the plant that winter, quietly, the way these things usually resolved in a small town. No dramatic headline, just an absence at the loading yard the next time Mark drove past it. He never spoke to Denny again after that day at the feed store. He didn't need to. The field said everything that needed saying, every season after that one, without Mark having to explain a single word of it to anyone who asked. By the following spring, the story had traveled the same roads the dumping and the rumor once had. But it sounded different now. Neighbors who'd kept a careful distance during the worst of it started stopping by Mark's fence line instead, asking real questions about solarization and soil recovery. A few of them went further than questions. Pruitt, the same grower who'd warned Mark about the rumor at the co-op that summer, was the first to arrange his own load of cull produce from the plant that spring, properly authorized this time, hauled in on purpose instead of dumped in the dark. Spread and tarped across a stretch of his own tired ground the same way Mark had. A second farm followed within the month. Julie helped walk them both through it, the same careful process, the same patient waiting through the summer heat, soil samples taken before and after so the results would hold up to scrutiny the way Mark's had. Mark answered every question he got, though he made a point of giving Julie Ruiz the credit for the science whenever anyone asked how he'd figured it out. He hadn't figured out the science. He'd just refused to let someone else's cruelty, and someone else's rumor, be the last word on what that field could become. Mark stood at the edge of his east field the following summer, watching Hector check irrigation lines 2 rows down, Julie's business card still pinned to the corkboard in his kitchen in case he ever needed a second opinion on anything again. He still kept the photographs from that first morning, the flies, the rot, the wreckage, filed away in the same battered notebook where he now kept every season's soil test results too. Not as a trophy. Just as a reminder of exactly how wrong somebody's assumption about an empty field, and the man who owned it, had turned out to be, twice over. He'd think, sometimes, about how close it had come to going the other way, how easily a man with less stubbornness, or less help, might have just paid the hauling bill. Planted over it, and let the rumor fade on its own without ever knowing what that field could have become. The valley didn't change everything overnight. But nobody drove past his east field and called it empty anymore, and nobody repeated the old rumor either. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. Everything Mark discovered in this story is grounded in a real, documented agricultural technique called biosolarization. Standard soil solarization uses clear plastic tarp and direct sunlight to raise soil temperature high enough to kill weed seeds, nematodes, and soil-borne pathogens without chemical fumigants. Biosolarization takes that a step further by adding organic material, often agricultural processing waste, underneath the tarp, which accelerates the process through decomposition heat and shifts in soil chemistry. Research conducted at California's Kearney Agricultural Research and Extension Center specifically studied tomato processing residues for exactly this purpose, finding that tomato pumice amendment raised soil temperatures and created conditions strongly associated with soil pest and pathogen inactivation. It's real science, developed to give farmers in high-value horticultural regions a non-chemical option for soil pest management, proof that even the ugliest mess, handled with the right knowledge, can become something a field actually needed. If you learned something new today, that's exactly what this channel is for. Every Farm Route Chronicles story is built around a real agricultural technique. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment telling us which story's technique surprised you the most.